whatever there is, there are always three levels. There are always three levels of affairs. There is this, we could call it a gross level, right? That this immediate level of what is available to our perception, understanding, cognition, and so forth. Then there is a subtle level which is not that easily accessible because it's simply not at the surface level of affairs. And there is this, what we could call of as causal level. Causal. In other words, we're speaking here of that same understanding that shared by many schools of various systems, that there is this what corresponds to waking, dreaming, deep sleep, or to the physical, astral, and karmic or causal realm. And of course, we should immediately say that none of these realms have existence of their own, as you know very well by now. There are nothing other than the frequencies of one and the only, transcendent, which is never tainted by anything that happens at any of its levels of how it may manifest itself here and there. So if we first begin to enter this topic from this understanding, this will be easier for us, so that A, we do not go straight to the ultimate level and bypass an opportunity to examine it from the other levels, because other levels play an important role in our daily life, one way or another. And at the same time, it introduces a possibility of feeling into it with greater degree. This feeling into it is, as a footnote and a very important part of this teaching, it's perhaps the most subtle, by the way. Very easy to kind of lose the importance of that what this feeling represents here, and this why we feel that the first book that we are all working on, right, our respective departments, should bring clarity on that. It's, remember, we call it cherry on the cake of self-realization, cherry on the cake of all these, what could be spoken of in terms of the ultimate goal of why we're here. And let's say the ultimate goal of why we're here is to realize our essential nature. Then once that is being realized, then that cherry on the cake is that what is represented by the teaching of the rasa, right? Remember? The theory of rasa. All that, that aesthetic astonishment, the chamatkara. This is just as a footnote. So in other words, it's also an opportunity to have this, what question presents, and whatever is happening, whatever is in the field of our awareness, as a kind of field where we test, in a way, the acuteness of our understanding, but also the acuteness of how alive are we. Because if we only adopt that cold card, I would call, or clear card, if you prefer, of that non-dual understanding, of that Advaita understanding that at the ultimate level nothing is happening, or at the ultimate level this is all due to play of consciousness. Therefore, no matter how horrifying it is at the immediate level of perception, understanding, and whatever is available to our faculties, then therefore it is unimportant. This will also be a kind of potentially unwanted perspective. Just what comes to mind immediately here is this sort of a reminder that he will not be a sage if he would not feel deeply and able to rise above personal suffering. And in any case, what quality of that sagehood is there if there is nothing to rise above? I'm paraphrasing. So in other words, what is being spoken here is that every one of you who have reached this level of understanding that there is nothing other than one's own self, my own self, and yet whatever is happening at the more superficial, let's say, surface level of affairs, it doesn't mean that it does not affect us. It does, and this is the mark of how mature we are in our unfoldment, because if it doesn't take any quality of the heart to rise above this, then what value of that in the first place? What value does it hold? So we'll move from here. So this, right, back to the question. So where is this animosity, right? Where is this? Originally, I think you have put it together slightly differently. That where is that come from, in the sense of that hostility, right, between the USA and Russia. Now, if we are to go into the historical ramifications and repercussions of that, of course, we can easily lose ourselves there. Suffice to point out something here, which is quite peculiar, is that actually the United States as a country and Russia, even if we are to speak of the Soviet Union, right, have never had an open military conflict throughout its history. So they have never been in a state of real war, let alone in an open combat. Yes, there have been long years of the Cold War, and most of you know about it, and many people today speak of the great potential for the return of that Cold War, simply because of what is happening literally as we speak. But I want to draw your attention here to still very obvious and gross reasons behind this. And this what may come across as a sense of hostile attitude need to be examined very, very carefully. To begin with, there is no such thing as hostility between the people of the countries, because the people of the countries are just people. And many Americans are ex-Russians. Less so in reverse, although there are quite a growing number of Americans who actually come and settle in Russia. Funny enough, I've learned about it myself only very recently, only in the past couple of years, but this is a fact. So as far as the countries are concerned, and if we are to speak of its people, then there is no animosity. In any case, all this animosity is being masterminded by propaganda. Propaganda which works at both ends. So at this superficial level of affairs, this propaganda goes very far back. I just will bring a couple of reminders for the general knowledge, but not to dwell on it for too long, because I don't want to kind of take your attention too much on that. However, it might be helpful. I don't think that this, what now I'm using this simply term because it's formed part of the question, that hostility, that kind of dislike, right? Let's put it in parentheses, can be traced further back to beyond the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, the root potentially, and I'm sure there are works, dissertations, doctorates, and books written about that. I haven't read these books. I'm speaking purely from my life experience, observations, and what I have come across. That's all, really. The root of that is in the rise of a socialist system at some point in time that Russia has become, which greatly, in my view, threatened the ruling classes of then completely and utterly intact colonial systems of the world. And although America was in no way to be compared to the great colonies of Great Britain, France, and other countries, it became increasingly important as the power which many of these empires, as they begin to shrink, began to see in the face of America as that savior who could potentially protect the expansion of new ideology. Let's face it, at some point, United States embraced diametrically opposite values, even when we speak of the capitalism. I am not going to go into this full head because it's not the territory really that is mine. You can have other podcast discussions and material on this topic, but it is very well known. America embraced at some point a in some circles have been termed as a very aggressive form of capitalism, and which also was often spoken as the most progressive at the very same time. And although America had its fair share of its economical crises going all the way back to its formation as a country, including all these calamities that rocked the entire world in the first half of the 20th century, including the Great Depression of the 30s. And America wasn't much involved in the First World War, so I'm meeting that. But what is interesting that historically this kind of face of an enemy was formed very much when Russia turned into a very different country, ideologically speaking. Not many of you know that, but every single country at the time have tried to destroy the young republic that Soviet Union declared itself. Every single country. There was not a single country that recognized Soviet Union, and every country that was at the time was considered to be of some kind of value and weight on the political arena did everything to destroy it. Of course, by plunging Soviet Union into a bloody civil war. This will not be known by most of you because there is zero information about it in Western media, in Western historical even accounts and analysis. History was rewritten. What is interesting, however, is that Russia managed, or Soviet Union managed to defend itself. Although it was in pits, it was completely flattered to the ground in terms of its economy by the First War, which had to sign the most humiliating peace with Germany, and you remember that maybe, that with all these countries that in the fought, and this is, by the way, the background of how the Russian Revolution took place. I'm not going to go into a variety of reasons of how the power was usurped, political power usurped in Russia, because the Russian Revolution had not just a single revolution. There was this February Revolution and there was this November Revolution, right? So there's a October Revolution, rather. There was a different takes on that. So going back to this idea of where is ideologically this kind of antagonistic perspective rose was there and then, because from there on, the expansion of socialism around the globe began, and in a relatively short time, United States found itself surrounded by several countries, all of them, by the way, and most of them Latin American countries, which took a very different course. In fact, in the history of political sciences, socialism spread in several principal historical phases. One that followed the Russian Revolution, and another that followed the Second World War. But already back then, you remember Mexico, you remember later on Cuba, but all these other Latin American countries suddenly becoming socialist. Of course, for the American system, this posed a very, very difficult and very, very threatening time, because this was the time of ideological resistance between two systems. So therefore, the propaganda machine began its work. In the United States, Russia was painted as, enemy number one, and in the Soviet Union, America began to be painted as that very same in reverse. So this persisted for quite some times, until, of course, the leaders of both countries realized that this cannot continue, and they made several attempts on both parts to do something about this. So this whole, what the question brought, in my analysis and perspective, belongs to the ideology above all else. But what is interesting, however, and this is what makes this question more complex, is that with the demise of Soviet Union as the system altogether, that whole rhetoric, that anti-Soviet Union, or let's call it anti-Russian rhetoric, should have become the thing of the past. But we have observed that that did not happen. So therefore, there are some other questions that one wants to ask oneself. Why is that? What is it that somehow poses a certain difficulty with changing these rhetorics, changing the narrative, and finding ways to collaborate together, because Soviet Union and the United States were two superpowers. They were the only superpowers in the world. We all know that. We all know the race into the cosmos, race into this, race into that. Now, what I'm about to say, and this is just going to be last few sketches to move to the subtler realm of this, and this could be a biased perspective, therefore you don't have to really buy it, you don't have to share it. Somehow I feel that one should not ignore how these superpowers have been created and where did they draw their strength. For example, when we speak of the economical power of the United States, it is not a secret that the economical power of the United States entered into its really, really prime phase at the expense of the Second World War. This is no denying of that. Whereas Russia has been, as a country, in ruins twice in the course of the 20th century. First time at the end of the First World War, and second time at the end of the Second World War. It was completely in ruins. I mean, yes, the whole economy was turned into the military machine during the 5 years from 1941 to 1945, but it doesn't mean that that military machine was able to actually function as a fully and healthy economy, fully developed, fully recovered, healthy economy. And yet, despite of all that, Russia managed to enter that race with the United States, and in many cases, again, one can argue whether this was important or not only show that they're on par, but beat Americans in their own game in terms of certainly who will send the man into space first, who will send the first woman into the space, and who will even send the first dog into space. Russian did it all first. Okay, then landing on the moon. So if that happened, Americans were the first. What it shows us is an interesting thing, and I'm just saying this as I said, and potentially I could be biased. There is this, maybe at a more subtle level, a certain unacknowledged fear within certain high echelons of power in the United States, but in the West in general. And that also comes with a deep mistrust towards Russia. And this also not without admiration, even if it's not openly spoken. Simply because you cannot not admire the country and its people who have managed to raise from the ashes when it comes to the economy. And Russia does not take, Russia could be spoken of in terms of the colony, but it's not a colony like Great Britain or like France in Africa and Middle East. You see, Russia absorbed territories in immediate borders within itself over historical times. But that cannot be the source of Russian wealth. So yes, it had a lot of territory to fall back onto in terms of its reserves, because it's an incredibly rich country in terms of its resources, and as well as human resources, despite of its own genocide, which was launched by Stalin during the Stalinist era on its own people, again out of fear for these very human resources. I mean, how many of you know that the 2 years before the start of the World War II, Stalin literally first persecuted, then exterminated 20 greatest military commanders of his army. It's like shooting himself, whatever, not just in the foot. The war is about to start. It was imminent. It was very clear in terms of the geopolitical situation and the ambitions of the Nazi Germany at the time. And yet Stalin slaughters the very brains of his military might by sending all these people in gulags or simply shooting them, because this was all based on his fear that these people may somehow be too smart for their own good. And that does not end on the generals. This was extended to intellectuals. It was extended to people who were considered as Russian intelligentsia, who were not homogeneously Russian in terms of the DNA, because when we say Russian, it's a very complex term. Russian can be a Tatar, a Jew, a Georgian, an Uzbek, a Tajik, and many other ethnicities, as long as they spoke Russian and had this kind of like shared consensus. They were all considered Russians, and this is how very often in the West the Soviet Union was addressing the whole nations of the country that ceased to be after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So this is just a hint that this kind of painting Russians as the threat to the world, wickedness, like every James Bond movie, not just America. And the fair response would be it's not just American narrative that was. It's this perhaps very strong or stronger in the Anglo-Saxon world, because Anglo-Saxon world was primarily impacted by American propaganda more than any other, and greatly shared by the sentiments that was coming from the high power in the United Kingdom. So of course, remember all the old Bond movies, or many movies that were made. Yes, absolutely. The villain has to have some links to Russia. Even if he's not the villain, he has to be some kind of mad scientist, or he has to be someone who is really unscrupulous, and he's here behind the potentially bringing the danger to the world. Now, to give justice to this still superficial level of affairs, I would like to direct your attention to real sources now. Okay, so I would share some links later, but just to say, you need to listen the talks of likes of oh gosh, forgot his first name, Pozner. His first name will come up, but his second name is Pozner. He's a unique person, born in Paris in 1934, and to a Jewish father from Russian background and French mother. His parents separated, and his mother took young boy and moved to New York. So he grew up in New York. And at the age of 19, he decided to go to Russia, of all the places. And we're talking about Russia back then, Soviet Union. And he lived in Russia, worked in Russia as a journalist. He is a very rare breed of these independent journalists. They're dying out. It's a dying out breed. Pozner was the man who has created the famous bridge. It was literally called a bridge between two audiences. Still, the Cold War was full swing. At least a decade before the collapse of Soviet Union, he began this televised audiences between American and Russian people. Later, Hugh Donahue, some of you who are old enough may remember this name, a brilliant, again, entrepreneur and a journalist and TV presenter, suggested that Pozner joins him, and they have together broadcasted this on the massive level. I watched these programs myself, still back in my native town of Uzbekistan, of Tashkent. And, this was the prime aim of that, was to introduce Russian people and American people who have never had the chance to see each other and converse over these years of the Cold War, so as to reconcile these differences. So maybe this is, yes, thank you very much. That's Vladimir Pozner. Yes, I was thinking Vladimir, but too many Vladimirs these days, so you never know. So Vladimir Pozner was a unique journalist who spoke without an accent in perfect American English, perfect Russian and French. So he embodies in himself these qualities of being an American, being Russian, and being European. So I will share some links with you. He gave this brilliant lecture at Yale University in the United States, not that long ago, few years ago, maybe 3, I don't know, 4. And it is available out there. It is simply known as How the US Created Putin. It's an eye-opening. And you will learn a lot from that lecture because you will understand, and it's also accompanied by questions and answers with the audience. He speaks there, he brings his concerns deeply. He dedicated his life to making sure that there is this continued communication between the two great nations. The nations of the United States and the nations of the Soviet Union and later on Russia. So when you will have the chance to get introduced into this, you will learn that people have always been manipulated, and this is part and parcel of how autocratic societies work and function. So, of course, what happens today in the world repeatedly reaffirms that democracy is but an empty slogan. It's simply a kind of word without real substance. When Maharishi Mahesh Yogi used to say in the 90s, damn the democracy, I used to cringe because to me it felt a little like, gosh, this is just, okay, I love everything, I love you, Guruji, but why you have to say this? But I understood that it took me quite a few years to realize what it meant by the master, damn the democracy, because there's no democracy. There's no democracy. Personal interests run the show, and personal interests are being put ahead of national interests, and everything is turned upside down. So that this reality we are now faced with is not as pretty as we would like it to be. And the more we find out about it, the uglier it seems to look. So how does that all sit with regard to the subtler states of affairs? So as I have already hinted that this what could be spoken of in terms of the that term used in parentheses as hostility is actually not a hostility. Now, I'd like you to change the gear and stay with me and go into the different level of understanding altogether. The two propelling forces are always in motion, always in action. You know that we spoke about this, right? This is primarily the force of Kali. It's represented by the force of that aspect of Shakti that represents here this and rules over the domain of all that, what we could speak of like laws of nature, fundamental laws of nature. The gravity, the electromagnetism, the force of attraction and the force of what propels. This what attracts and that what propels. Attraction and propulsion, they are complementary forces. They are qualities of the very same energy. So in other words, there's no attraction unless there is the propelling force. So at the subtle level of affairs, this is how this, what we speak of now in terms of that global affair of how one nation can have a certain relationship to another nation based on this understanding. But let immediately transfer this onto any other sphere of our life, and you, if you are honest enough, introspective enough, you will find that these very same forces work in every relationship. in every partnership, in every amorous relationship, in every family, in every situation where there is any degree of closeness, which is a result of that, what here the magnetic force of attraction represents. Siblings love each other, and there is already within that, there is this force that propels them at some point to become the greatest enemies. This is the proverbial state of affairs when it comes to when the dispute is being brought at the level of the family. You can read that in the best-selling novels, or you can read that in the epics, as in the Mahabharata. We can see that in the clan of Pandavas and Kauravas that are, despite the fact that they grew up together and played as kids, becoming the deadly enemies when they face each other on a battlefield. So these propelling and attracting forces work together between husband and wife, between any relationship that there is these forces. Understanding these forces, accepting them, knowing how to work with them, is what is our job. So this is what happens at the subtler state of affairs. There is this, I would even go as far as to say there is a fascination on both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific. There's a fascination. Do you know that as a kid I asked my auntie to sew me an American flag here when I was about, maybe 10, because everything American was cool, chic. American jeans. If you have American jeans, you've made it, man. These were the days of the Jimmy Carter, by the way, the president who has tried to warm up the cold climates of the Cold War. And it's not a secret at all. Everything American was in vogue. And I don't think just for the kids who grew up in Soviet Union. That same truth was in many parts of the world. When that kind of reverberance of the American dream was still carried some meaning, though patched up already because of the 60s and the 70s, until everyone had a rude awakening and realized that there is no such thing as an American dream. The dream turned into a nightmare. So we live now in hopefully the time when we are capable of awakening from that nightmare of a dream. That the imposition of certain values which were rooted in indulging, and more indulging cannot serve for too long. It will not take a qualified tantric yogic or Vedic scholar. It will take a kid who is familiar with these teachings to see how rotten are the premises of a culture which tries to make this into the very leitmotif of its life. Because that's what American consumerism was rooted in, to provide people unending pleasure. You see? So that life meant to be that. And this is utopia. And utopia sooner or later turns into dystopia. Just as socialism was a utopia, because even though I personally consider many values of socialism being by far more evolved in terms of their understanding of what is required. However, they did not count or account too much for the psychology of a human being. They forgot that the psychology of a human being cannot be simply rested upon ideological understanding. But a lot of things in the social system were much more progressive. If you ask me what do you mean by that, I will tell you. The best schools in the West, Montessori and Waldorf schools, were all fashioned by the examples developed by some of the luminaries of the early 20th century. For example, the impact of Uspensky on the reforms of how the education should be really found its full implementation in the Soviet school system, whereas the so-called English system adopted in majority of English institutions, from top to down, from top to bottom, from Oxford and Cambridge down to the public schools, was a very different state, based on a very, very old, outlived, in fact, completely useless systems in terms of what it means to bring out creative individual. Therefore, it's interesting that Waldorf schools are considered alternative schools, adopted a lot of these teachings of these, what are they, educators, psychologists, right, thinkers of our time. And yet, the ideas of Uspensky were fully implemented when the Soviet education needed to go through the reforms so as to bring another way of how to educate its youth. Free health system, state subsidized, not privately subsidized. So in other words, education and health systems were all responsibility of the state, which reassures that no big pharma will become into what it has become. Because when it becomes an enterprise, it's dangerous. The state of people's health has to be the affair of the state, not the affair of a private company. You cannot privatize health of the individuals because it will find its way that sickness, because that in itself is a sickness, how to make more profit, will find its way to use the loops and loopholes and turn things upside down, because if it cannot rest upon the notions and upon the premises that the healthy individual, it's the healthy state, but the healthy individual doesn't bring profit, so sooner or later you need to find a way how to perpetuate illnesses in society. And the more illnesses are, the richer you become. These are the very simple mathematics, not a rocket science. So we can disagree, we can be angry, we can be furious about what the big pharma does, just based on what happened just now, right, with vaccines, with the pandemics. But these are only the outer signs of what is actually happening, because this is rooted in the system itself. But one way or another, the socialism was doomed. So therefore that another utopia turned into dystopia, because it decided to build a society purely on these ideological grounds, which were not even connected to the what we speak of here as that vertical dimension of life. It was completely horizontal through and through. So back to that attraction and repulsion, so that the subtle level, this is what is really, really happening there. So you need to be aware of that force in your own dealings, relationships, likes and dislikes, connections you have. Because when we are aware of that, it doesn't take us by surprise. It's like one can have a certain degree of psychological discontent. Is how come I love this person, You know, like let's say one day I feel so warm and so connected, and the next day something goes against my liking, and there is this, you know, I'm fuming with rage, I'm fuming with criticism, disapproval, and the rest of it. Well, something else is working here, you see? So that what we call love, right? Care, attraction is all based on just one form of that energy. But another side of it is that what is represented here by a propelling force. So this is just two sides of the same coin, we could say. And of course, karmically speaking, it depends on what system of thought we adopt here. As you know, in Kashmir Shaivism, by now I hope that Shiva is the only cause of everything. So whatever happens here at the phenomenal level, we cannot blame anyone. We cannot. It's a futile and it's useless exercise. From we're equipped with this understanding to look for what is the original cause. The cause here is in the very nature of consciousness, which seeks entertainment for its own sake. It seeks to play and seeks to plot because it allows the possibility for a multitude of dramatic unfoldments. And this takes a lot of psychological maturity to be able to behold it with that eye of non-dual awareness and without being perplexed by it, of which I hope we will speak later when we move on to some other inquiries. So much for hostility, you see? No hostility whatsoever, and has never been. And yet, look how much drama, and all this drama is of course real. So where does it leave you? Only you can answer that. Only you can know. Because you are that. So there's no way out of that. There's no quick, some kind of solution bypassing. Anything one would try to do, it would still be one way or another to the amount of how much awareness there is. So let's maybe put a pause here, and I will now give it to you back again.